several special guests today, and we are excited to hear about Character Compass, a book that was written by Scott, Madora, and Shelby. So would you just start off telling us how the three of you got connected and how you all decided that this was something that you wanted to do?
Shelby and I actually started off as doctoral students with Scott back in 2013. Both applied to and wanted to go to graduate school for reasons inextricably connected to character. Before we started, Scott's first edition of Character Compass, I kind of joke about it, word for word, cover to cover, meticulously, and it, had a huge influence on both of us and how we see character and how we care about it and how we implement it in our work. When Scott reached out to us about writing a second edition, it was just a huge honor and something that we've just loved. We get to be a part of. Both an interest in and commitment to character education coupled with this opportunity to work with Scott on a Character Compass in particular.
Shelby and Madora came to Boston and we worked together for 5 or 6 years during their doctoral student years. They then departed into important work they're doing now. When an opportunity came up to do a second edition of the book, I realized that I felt very clear that some of the things that I thought the original version of Character Compass were missing were things that Madora and Shelby had been working on over the last 7, 8, 9 years. And I think the second edition wouldn't have happened without their collaboration, because the vision I have for where the book needed to go in the second edition was really tightly connected to expertise that they've spent years now developing.
That is such a cool story. I mean, that's what you hope when you write a book, is that it's able to influence other people, but it influenced other people not only to further their educational journey, but also specifically in the character education. Thank you all for sharing that. So first edition was written in 2012, as we've stated, and then there's another one in 2025. What made you decide, I need to revisit that first edition? What was the impetus for doing that and expanding those case studies in the book?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I'd say there were two major factors. When I wrote the first edition in 2012, I think that I was one of the folks, like not the original person, but one of the folks who contributed to thinking about how to parse character into moral, performance, and civic dimensions. I would say that from my perspective, the first person to really think about character in those dimensions was David Shields at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, who wrote an article in Phi Delta Kappa that I found really influential. So when I wrote the original version of Character Compass, I wrote about 3 different schools. One school that focused on moral character, one school that focused on performance character, one school that focused on civic character. In the intervening years, for lots of different reasons, partially, from working with Shelby, partially from my conversations with philosopher Jason Baer at Loyola Marymount, and partially from the character education world kind of solidifying a model of character development that included moral, performance, and civic character, but also intellectual character. It started to feel to me, like the book is missing something. Like it's missing that fourth pillar of character that organizations like the Jubilee Center and the John Templeton Foundation are using in their character model. So when the opportunity came up to do a second edition of the book, one of my thoughts was, this is an opportunity to sort of bring intellectual character into the book, which is real work that Shelby and Madora have been doing. That was one sort of key impetus. Second was just that, the book was originally published in 2012, so we're now, almost 15 years down the road. And it occurred to me that the young people who we spoke to at the 3 schools in the original book and a 4th school that was involved in Shelby's dissertation research were all now adults. And it seemed like sort of an exciting opportunity to try to track down some of the young people that we had talked to back when they were middle school students and high school students, who could now, as adults, tell us retrospectively about the impact that attending these schools with different character focuses have had on their personal and professional trajectories. And so
that is really cool, because you're building on the previous work that you had started. Your research offers a rare longitudinal lens on character education's impact, and that's not something that you find. It is very rare to find the longitudinal for, I think, a variety of reasons. What do you find most interesting or significant in how character education has shaped students over time?
Thank you so much for that question. Something that's really great is that we did see this long-term impact of character education on students over time. In particular, in the intellectual chapters, we see the students saying everyone needs to be learning these character strengths. Across the board, there were very few students who said that this had a negative impact on me. That was a really encouraging element of the longitudinal aspect of our study. There's a really interesting interesting one in the civic character school, as he was doing the interview, realizing that all of a sudden this has actually had a huge impact on him, that now he's going back to doing political studies. As he was interviewing with Scott, realizing that actually this, his character education school had a huge impact on him, and why he wants to go back into political studies. We're seeing across the board in all four of these schools, the students saying that, these schools did have a huge impact in how they're choosing to live their lives as adults now. From the school administrator side, we're also hearing some really interesting results about how we implement character education in schools, and how we both do it in good ways and other ways that we have to consider the difficulties of implementing character education. Bright Ideas Middle School, they were a charter school focused on intellectual character education. And a big takeaway from that school was that maybe we also need to focus on social emotional learning a little bit more at the same time, and that helps us with our behavioral needs with our students as a middle school. After being open for several years now, they have some new takeaways that they've learned over the years. Whereas we have another school, which the Classical Academy, which was focused on moral strengths, where they had an ethics curriculum that was very strong. They moved away from that ethics curriculum for various reasons. And now they've learned after time that they actually want to reintroduce that ethics curriculum in a new way that's responding to the moment of the time, because they know that it had such a strong impact on their students. I think it's really wonderful to see over the longitudinal period these lessons that the schools have learned.
Only the students, but the leaders in those schools as
Yeah.
well. I bet that is really rewarding as researchers to be able to see that kind of impact that continues to take place and how people have evolved. In the book, it closes with 11 key takeaways for schools to cultivate this type of character formation in their context. What are some of those key takeaways, and which ones do you think are most foundational, or maybe even perhaps overlooked by schools when they are starting to do this process of integrating character education?
Great. Thank you for the question. And I would say something I really like about the second edition of the book is that in that final chapter where we offer these takeaways that you just mentioned, I think we're able to get much, much more specific than we were in the original version of the book. I feel really good about that in terms of the idea of the book being useful to the K-12 educators invested in character work. One takeaway that I think I found really important was that across the four schools we were looking at that were focusing on different types of character, they all took what we call a both and approach to the character education work, in the sense that each school had a specific delivery system for character education content. In one school focused on moral character, it was an ethics course. In a school focused on civic character, and in the schools focused on civic character, intellectual character, it was a weekly advisory period. In the school focused on performance character, it was sort of a weekly community meeting. And they all had very explicit delivery system for character content. And then also, each of the four schools thought very explicitly about how to bring the content raised in that specific space into curriculum and programming across the rest of the school. The schools found ways to take the learning in that sort of primary learning space and spread it throughout the school, including curriculum. Where students in the civic characters in school were reading a novel in their English course, the educator leading the discussion about the novel might seek out opportunities to talk about the importance of social responsibility coming up in the novel. You likewise saw similar things happening in the other schools. That both and approach was something that seems quite important to me. And what it buys you is a common vocabulary across the whole school for talking about important matters, like whether those are celebratory matters or tragedies. Of course, educators in schools need to be ready to talk about the tragedies that happen in our communities and our society. What we saw happening in each of the four schools, because of that both and approach they took to character education, they really had developed a specific vocabulary for talking about important matters. And those were different vocabularies across the schools, but it really enabled the members of those school communities to speak meaningfully to each other. Those are a couple of the takeaways that struck me as most meaningful.
I think one of the things that really struck me is that there isn't one right way to do character. There's not one dimension that has to be chosen, but that it really matters that you decide as your school community what matters to you and that you really hone in on that. I think that kind of like homegrown approach as one of the takeaways is so important too, that these kind of, if it's just super isolated and not integrated, it doesn't have that same kind of integrated holistic approach. One of the things I was really struck by, kind of tying in what Shelby was talking about too, is how reflective the educators and the students and the educators were about what worked and what didn't. They were really honest about kind of what didn't work and what they were changing, because so much of being a teacher, and certainly connected to character education, is we have to be reflective about, are we really meeting the needs of our students and the needs of our school? I think that deciding what works for you, thinking about how to nurture this homegrown approach while also being really reflective, I think are really key pieces and through lines that are really important.
Wow, yes, that reflective piece on what works and what doesn't is so important. A lot of times as educators, maybe that's a piece we don't want to talk about as much, but you learn just as much from what doesn't work well as you do from what does work well. I love that common vocabulary, Scott, that you pulled out. I mean, that seems like it's a key piece to making this successful in different schools. As researchers that are working really closely with practitioners in the field, how did this experience shape how you think about your own work and approaching how you support schools?
It's such a great question, because I think that, one of the things that's really, I think, fun about getting to do research is you kind of get into so many different classrooms and so many different schools. I always, tell my student teachers, just get into as many classrooms as you can. Ask people if you can observe, what are some takeaways. I feel with this book was a huge opportunity to think not only about our own teaching in our own university classrooms, but also in preparing teacher educators, what are the things that they can reflect upon and bring to their own teaching? And just one example, and we refer to this one a fair amount, but from the intellectual character school, were the teachers who said, if we care about curiosity and we care about students asking questions, but then we shut down those questions, then are we really modeling what we say that we care about? That idea of modeling what we care about is so important. They would say, if you can get me off topic for 15 minutes but with a question you've asked, that means you've asked a really good question. And that doesn't mean ask about your vacation and get me off topic. It means if you can ask me a really insightful question that gets me off topic, then you're doing exactly what I've asked you to do. I've been thinking a lot about that too in terms of my own classroom. How am I really encouraging questions and really honoring them in a way that really honors the work that the Intellectual Character School of Bright Ideas Middle School did. That's just one example.
That is a great example. And that modeling piece, too, is just so important and so key. Looking ahead, what questions about character education do you think most urgently need research attention?
Thank you for that question. So this edition of Character Compass, what I think it does a nice job of doing, and what I hope is helpful for educators and school leaders is it sort of says, here's a model of a school that's putting a lot of its chips on moral character development. And then here's a school that's putting a lot of its chips on performance character development. Here's a school that's putting a lot of its chips on civic character development. We've tried through a mixed methods, longitudinal project to really show in detail what the work is that the schools are doing to nurture those specific types of character, and then what impact it's having on students, both in the moment and even down the road. And so I hope that that's a really useful resource for schools as they think about their own character goals. But of course, none of those schools that and we did choose schools very deliberately that had sort of put their chips on a particular type of character development. But we don't think that schools and school communities need to choose a single type of character to be the focus of their work. We're not trying to argue that you have to only focus on moral character or only focus on performance character. I don't think any of the schools that we profiled would describe themselves in that way. I do think they would say, yes, we have sort of chosen an area of emphasis. And so when I think about what's a logical next area of research coming out of this project, it seems to me that there's some work to be done looking at how schools do that integrative work across these four dimensions of character. It seems the character education community has agreed, at least for now, that these four dimensions of character are a useful way of thinking about character development and a useful way of talking about character development. There are scholars like Jason Baer who have written about the interconnections between the four types. I think there's some work to be done looking at how schools could sort of choose character strength in each of those four areas and work in sort of impactful ways to holistically to do character work with their students.
Yeah, that sounds like a great logical next step, is to be able to integrate all of those. And any other things that you would like to share with our audience? Anything?
Madora and I are also specifically working on the ideas of intellectual risk taking, which is a big part of what we chat about in terms of what happens in the intellectual character school, not only in terms of civic dialogue, which is really important. We need to be risk takers in terms of how we engage in civic conversations, but also in terms of how we engage in classrooms and allowing for risk taking in the classroom. That's an area of research that we are particularly engaged in and interested in continuing to study. So again, that idea of intellectual and civic character intersecting with one another.
Well, it has been so inspiring to hear how a book that was written in 2012 brought you all together and that you are continuing that work. I do want to do a plug for your book and make sure everybody knows Character Compass, How Powerful School Climate Can Point Student Towards Success, second edition. Thank you all for taking time, and not only for the time that you have taken now, but for all the countless hours that you have put into doing this research, because it is important research.
Oh, thank you for having us. It was a pleasure to talk about it.